When we think about composition, we think about not what the things in the photograph are, but where they are in relationship to each other. So, to think about composition, I've decided to start this off by going abstract and just arranging some shapes. So, this is a photo frame, and as a photographer, I've got to fill it. So let's try putting something in here. And we have a rectangle, and I've just sat it in the middle in the most obvious place. And is this a good composition? Well, we're just staring straight ahead, taking in a rectangle. So it is kind of a boring experience. Even if it was just a very interesting piece of subject matter, it's right there stuck in the middle. I wonder if we can change this up a bit. So let's try putting the same bit of subject matter slightly off to one side and down a wee bit lower. Now we've got empty space to play with. And now the possibilities for a bit of tension or a bit of some kind of narrative with the subject matter. Let's add another piece of subject matter, another rectangle, yeah, another piece of subject matter over at the other side. Notice just a little bit higher than that piece. That's now perhaps suggesting a bit of distance. Let's add another bit. And now we've got a bit more of a lively thing because now when your eye looks at this, there's it can either go from piece of subject matter to piece of subject matter in a little journey, normally from left to right, but you know you can do things that would make the eye go the other way, or the eye can follow next can snake through the negative space and you've got a little journey for the eye there. So we've definitely got more for the eye, even without having any actual subject matter, without any know, colour or associations or anything that makes subject matter interesting. This is definitely a more interesting composition than the first one you saw. So we know that composition can affect how we see a picture. What about then if we make some further changes? So we think about positive and negative space. We think about composition, and they're quite evenly balanced just now. There's a bit more negative space. Um, let's up the negative space even more. And now we've got a lot more negative space and maybe a bit more of a feeling of distance happening here. Um, so let's see what else we can add to that. And what I'm going to do is stick a few lines in. And the way these lines are placed, these are diagonal lines. And from a fairly static uh, composition before, there's now a little bit more of a sense of movement. So a little bit more dynamic, you might say. There's a bit of energy. You can see, I can, beforehand I was saying you would read this left to right. Now I can see the energy in this going from right to left. A bit sort of, anti-clockwise kind of a style. Um, but also what this does is it really suggests depth. So these lines emphasize the perspective, emphasize some kind of perspective. Well, in this picture, they're creating perspective. Um, I'll show you what I mean later when I say emphasizing perspective. Um, so that's uh, another thing we could add. However, let's see if we can still keep adding stuff to this to make it more interesting, to make, like any other compositional ideas we can bring in. And I decided to stick another different, contrasting piece of subject matter sitting now in front of that, so I've got a bit of overlap. So now I've got even more depth happening here because there's some overlap, and I've got something now sitting right in the foreground. Now, when the before we had the yellow triangle, we couldn't tell which of the blue big rectangles was further forward. We knew that the wee one was in the background, but we couldn't really get an idea. But now we can definitely tell that uh, thing is in that triangle is in the foreground. So we've almost created a bit of a foreground. We've got a foreground background, and we're kind of creating a bit of a midground here now. So let's add another shape. Okay, and now we've got a circle. Now what do we think about this as a composition? Well, I think that's kind of killed it because there's a little bit of a struggle going on between these two, uh, the circle and the triangle. That they're kind of fighting against each other a little bit here, both looking for dominance. Let's see if there's different things we can do with the circle to try and deal with that and make it a more interesting picture, maybe have a bit more of a story going on. I also think these two sitting at the same level is kind of killing them a wee bit as well. So I've tucked the circle behind that, and so now I would say that's a bit more interesting. There's more layers happening here, but the layering at the left-hand side is the opposite of the layering at the right-hand side. If the two rectangular pieces of subject matter are said to relate to each other in some way, then we can see that what I've got is, the situation on either side. So there's a bit of kind of mirroring here, but it's not. It's inverse, but it's still a compositional relationship there. And oh yeah, I made one more little change as well. Now we've got a very dominant piece of subject matter. So that's another compositional, device there is making clear it's dominant. What's it doing? It's much bigger and it's sitting right in front. And in fact, it's now kind of overlapping. It's going so far up, it's overlapping stuff in the background. So it's very dominant. Let's see what else I can do here. So I decided to move these guys around a little bit to allow the triangle to dominate a wee bit more. And then I think I made one more change. Uh, and so now I'm going through this thing as well. There's a line running through that. Uh, just because, we're doing an abstract here, but however that would translate into composition, it's definitely created more of a feeling of space. So what I'm trying to say here is that everything I've done here has just been compositional decisions. They've all contributed to some kind of, abstract, but some kind of understanding of space and relationships between bits of subject matter. Right, so we're talking very abstract. This is another word for talking this way in art. This is very formal. Okay, it's just to do with forms and the way things look, rather than any implied meaning in them. So there's a good art word for you. So this is a Martin Parr photograph. It's a pretty quirky photograph. We at it and we might kind of smile and think quite like that straight away. And there's lots of reasons, in terms of subject matter and the visual elements and photographic techniques. But there's also compositional reasons why this works. So let's try and draw some of these abstract lines on this picture to see what they are. So let's just follow some of the lines that we've got going in the picture. So there's the two very obvious ones. Now, before, when I was creating my abstract picture, I was trying to create a feeling of space. So I had some diagonal lines. going at different angles to each other, creating an idea of perspective. These lines do the opposite. These lines are parallel. These kind of create more of a kind of feeling of a wall, um, or they create, maybe you could say, three fields, but they're certainly not any further away from each other. Now I know that we know in the photograph they are, but visually that that is flat. Okay, there's flattening happening there. What else? We've decided that there is a main piece of subject matter that's got a bit of an angle going on, and then it kind of lines up with the top of that top line there. It goes a wee bit beyond it, but not much. And then there's a bit of subject matter to the side, less dominant, and at the bottom of that lines up with the bottom line, and an even less dominant piece of subject matter at the other side, balancing that. And again, the bottom of that shape lines up pretty much with the bottom yellow line. Right, so there you go. Let's see what it looks like without the photograph. And there we go. And so, right, so now we can look at this and think about it again in a more formal way. So, like we said before, we've got a dominating piece of subject matter. We've got a sort of lack of perspective happening here. Now, the reason I'm mentioning lack of perspective, because in the photograph that works, because it's what you call forced perspective. Because the photograph is designed in a way that makes us stop thinking about distance, makes the foot look like a giant foot. And the fact that the toenails are painted adds that little bit of flamboyancy that makes it a little bit funnier. And then the people on either side seeming to ignore the giant foot, there's a little bit of comedy in there. We've also got a bit of lining up that I was talking about. I think that helps force the perspective. I think keeping the foot like just in line with the sea helps, keep it within that area there. We talked about balance before, so these two shapes balance each other on either side of the dominating piece of foreground subject matter. And then if you look at the kind of angle they're sitting at, the two balanced ones agree with each other, and it's straight up and down, and the yellow lines are almost horizontal, so there's this kind of feeling of a grid there. And then there's this bit of dominating subject matter that's at a jaunty angle, offsetting those. Um, and that, translates, I think, into a kind of, flamboyant bit of subject matter saying, look at me, and it, a light-hearted, humorous kind of look. And so just racing through this one, I'll just stick some obvious lines down. This is a pretty easy composition to talk about if you got this one in an exam. A lot of perspective here. Like I said at the beginning, the perspective is being reinforced here with all these lines reminding us about it. And we've also got this dominant piece of subject matter here um, that is also creating a focal point. I'm just going to then go on to the last slide that shows you a diagram, but I've added extra things to talk about more things that are happening in the photograph. Before I go on to it, I'll very quickly mention that there's also other things that we've looked at before that are happening here. The layering. The layering is absolutely intense, though. It's not a couple of things in front of each other, it's hundreds of things in front of each other. Intense layering. The layering, you also have that with the framework in the roof, kind of rigging. And there's lots of repetition here as well. So we've got these, lines that go off into the distance, repeated windows and things. Okay, so I've got just a minute left to talk about that. So you can see dominant piece of subject matter framed by the kind of crowd on either side. You've got all these the lines that are emphasising the perspective are also drawing our subject or the eye towards the subject matter or just beyond the subject matter. But certainly it allows us then to, he's in the same area as that. I've tried to represent all that layering as well with those people. And oh yeah, the subject matter is off to one side to give it a little bit. Like I said, centralising things kills movement. Putting them off to one side creates a bit of imbalance and the possibility of movement in the picture. So that piece of subject matter has been placed there deliberately